Well, welcome everybody. My name's Catherine Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Bill McKibben and Vandana Shiva on social transformation, visions, and mobilizations. So we're really honored to have Bill and Vandana back to our campus, at least virtually. Bill was here, I think, in 2018, and Vandana, you were here in January this past year. They're both really, really great conversations. Already seems like a lifetime ago, but I have a memory of a really joyous intellectual conversation. So the Right Livelihood College is a tremendous opportunity to bring together visionary leaders from around the globe, working on diverse issues and in a variety of contexts, but with a common vision of a world rooted in human values and regenerative ecologies. UC Santa Cruz is honored to be the first Right Livelihood College campus in North America. So the purpose of today's discussion is to grapple with serious questions about the potential for real change in this moment of global pandemic, economic crisis, and change in leadership in the United States. What are the opportunities for real transformation around our economic and ecological systems? What should we be thinking about and working on related to reversing climate change and promoting economic justice? The word transformation is a key one for all of us right now, and it's no accident that we named our fledgling Social Sciences Institute the Institute for Social Transformation, but we always envisioned it as something bigger than just the social sciences, embracing the potential and the possibilities for transformative change in every field and every partnership, local and global, that we could create with others. Chris Fenner, our moderator today, is the inaugural director of the Institute, and he has taken that mantra of collaborative transformation very much to heart. Chris is also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and the Department of Environmental Studies, as well as a director of the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change. Chris's own work has impacted, and dare I say it, transformed the hearts and minds of students, colleagues, and even policymakers. His research on Uber drivers and other app-based transportation workers was recently cited in the official California Voters Guide related to Prop 22 in the last election. So Chris is going to be leading the discussion, and I couldn't imagine a better interlocutor for this exciting event. Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you all for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are in the world, for what promises to be a really wide-ranging conversation on this moment of really crisis in the world. And I was reminded recently, actually, by Catherine of Antonio Gramsci's comment where he said, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And we certainly have a lot of morbid symptoms in the world, whether we're talking about the dynamics around the US election, around the economic crisis, the pandemic. But what we really want to try and talk about today is the new being born, and what are the possibilities and opportunities in this moment for moving forward substantially the changes that we all know we need to see in the world. And we have with us today two people who really need no introduction, but I'm going to give just a tiny little introduction for each of them to bring them into the conversation. Of course, Bill McKibben is the founder and now senior advisor emeritus of 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and he's organized on every continent, including Antarctica. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was really regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change, and has really helped transform the dialogue. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award in 2014, and I just learned today that 2014 was another momentous day or year in his career, because biologists credited his career by naming a new species of woodland gnat in his honor. It's the Megaphlomedia McKibbeni. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but 2014 was a big year. And we also have with us today Vandana Shiva, who's really one of the world's most dynamic and provocative thinkers and has been for decades. At the core of her activisms, there has been around counter development to corporate globalization in favor of people-centered participatory processes, support for grassroots networks, women's rights and ecology, and really a commitment of a lifetime campaigning against genetic engineering and the negative impact of globalization. She received the Right Livelihood Award in 1993. And I want to bring you all into the conversation when you get a chance. I'll have some questions initially, but you'll see at the bottom of the screen the Q&A button. So just as we're going along, put your questions in there and we'll talk here for about half an hour and then bring in questions from the audience. And Bill, I want to start with you here in the US. We're, of course, in the midst of the fallout, perhaps is the right word, of the recent US election and anticipating the incoming Biden administration. I wonder if you could just talk for a little bit about what do you see as the implications of this recent US election and the incoming Biden administration for the climate change movement?
Well, that's a long and complicated question. And I think it needs to be kind of set in the context of where we find ourselves in this climate crisis, which is very far into it. It's as if finally our political systems are starting to take notice of the climate crisis. Sadly, we needed them to do it 30 years ago. And as a result, we're very much struggling now to try and catch up with the physics and chemistry of climate change, and it won't be easy. 2020 proves this to a T. I mean, this has been a year with many crises underway, but in a sense, all of them linked. The most important thing anyone said in 2020 was what George Floyd said when he was being murdered. I can't breathe. And people can't breathe because there's a cop kneeling on their neck. They can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant down the street, and it's always the same street as the one with the cop. They can't breathe because they've got COVID filling their lungs, and that follows the same lines of race and class. They can't breathe because the wildfire smoke is so intense that the authorities have told them to tape their windows shut and stay inside. They can't breathe because the pollution, the particulate pollution like it was in Delhi last week, is 14 times the World Health Organization standard. They can't breathe because it's too damn hot. It got to 130 degrees in California this summer, a new world record. That's at the edge of human survival, but it's going to be normal across too much of the planet on the trajectory we're on. So that's the backdrop, a backdrop where we're up to Hurricane Iota as of this morning, crushing the old record for most hurricanes in a year, sweeping across Central America, and we should very much have those people in our hearts and minds today. We need huge action fast. Sadly, the way the election came out, it seems unlikely that we're going to get huge action fast. We have, thank heaven, voted out Donald Trump, which is an enormous help on 1,000 grounds, including just plain mental health for everybody else. And certainly getting rid of a climate denier who took the US out of the Paris Climate Accords can't help but be a good thing. On the other hand, we appear stuck more or less with the same Senate that we had before. And with that goes the prospect for real and dramatic legislative achievement, I think, at least in the short run. The vision of a Green New Deal that was going to have $2 trillion in spending to roll out clean energy infrastructure across America seems highly unlikely. And so I think where we're going to be left for the moment is a very good faith effort by the incoming administration to find all the crevices and places they can to diligently try to make change without being able to spend the money that's really required. I think the most important of those holes, and we can talk more about this later, probably will have to do with financial regulation and the way that the Fed and the SEC and the Treasury Department put pressure on oil companies and banks and asset managers to begin backing away from hydrocarbons, hopefully quickly. Quickly being the operative word, the IPCC has told us in 2018 that we had until 2030 to fundamentally transform our energy systems, which they defined as cut emissions in half, or else our chances of meeting the targets we set at Paris just 5 years ago are forever by the board. So it's going to be a tense and fraught decade, but there is a huge movement now pushing in the right direction, and that movement will help. It weakens the power of the fossil fuel industry to resist change, as does the fact that the engineers have done a good job and knocked down the price of sun and wind to the point where they really could replace fossil fuels in short order if we wanted to. Got only a half-hearted answer in the last election, so stay tuned.
Yeah, and part of what I hear in what you're saying, Bill, is with this sort of non-transformation but slight shift in the administration and government, it's really going to depend on social movements to help move this forward. And I do want to come back to talk more about the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement in particular. But Vandana, I want to bring you in and hear your thoughts a little bit on the politics of this moment. Has gotten less publicity in the US, but I'm aware that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who often gets lumped together with Trump and Bolsonaro and others in sort of global right-wing conservative leaders, also faced an electoral challenge this last week. And in the state of Bihar, one of India's poorest states, hard hit by the pandemic, coalition, including his BJP party, was just returned to power. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you see the politics in India and the politics in the US election meaning in this moment for the grassroots movements that you're part of.
I've been not just looking at the globalization phenomena over the last 30 years, but coming from India, where actually Bihar was such an important part of the slavery of that time. Most people don't realize that indigo was cultivated under slave conditions, just like cotton in America. And all this was done in the name originally of free trade. Every empire is established through free trade agreements. The first was the Farukshir Farman with the East India Company, 1716. So the fact that we became independent, countries all over the world became independent of the British Empire. And we've had 30, 40 years of creating sovereign democratic systems. And then globalization started to nibble at both sovereignty and democracy. And it's not an accident that a certain kind of person who under sovereign democratic conditions could never have emerged as leaders did start to emerge as leaders all over the world. So if you think of it, what did this period of globalization do? It deregulated commerce, it deregulated accumulation and extraction of wealth, and in the process created the billionaires that are the real rulers of our times. And they then worked at changing electoral democracy. In your country, it was the Citizen United case, where stealing elections became the right to free speech. And in India, it became the electoral bonds, anonymous giving of money. 95% of this money went to one party. And who do they give the money to? The person who's going to deliver the goods for them through further deregulation and further dismantling of livelihoods and jobs and further destruction of environmental regulation. And it's not just the global treaties. This is happening every country. During it would be lovely to have some researcher map how during COVID, at a time where we realized that it's deforestation that's leading to new pandemics, and the IPBES has recognized this. exactly at this time, decisions unilaterally made to deforest further were being made by every government in every part of the world. They were not doing what was needed to protect the planet or people from new spread of infectious diseases. But then as this polarization, concentration of wealth increased, and I've written my book, Oneness versus the 1%, precisely because of this polarization, of course people will react. When jobs go, trade unions will fight. When peasants lose their incomes, and I remember doing a report for Cancun, where we showed about 15 billion is what Indian peasants were losing in that short period of 8 years of globalization. And right now they've lost much, much more. So they rise. How do you keep the progress down? You then start to use not just your big money, but the big technologies that do the big money with their royalties and their extraction and their social media and information control. Now, all of this is happening at the same time. So another phenomenon in every country is deflect from economic polarization and inequality to cultural polarization and a divide and rule policy. The British tried it in India, but think of it around the time of the Iraq War. Sam Huntington writes a book that says, I cannot know who I am till I know who I hate. So identity politics, instead of being, I'm a nurse, I'm a school teacher, I'm a farmer, I'm a trade unionist, I'm a professor, I'm a student, that identity just disappeared because those vocations and livelihoods disappeared. And now the negative identity was filled in the vacuum created by the very same people who put authoritarians in power, but they were authoritarians only for the public. They were puppets for the true rulers. And this phenomena has not changed. I think the big money decided, trust us, we've used him enough. We used Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, we used everything and put him in place. And a Newsweek article had said we've got the first artificial intelligence president. Well, the point is we'll get many artificial intelligence prime ministers and presidents till we reclaim economic democracy, because as long as the money machine has captured the electoral democracy, it will be a democracy for the billionaires, for the corporations, not for the people. And this is the challenge we face. This, to me, is the absolutely basic challenge, particularly because 30 years created concentration, but COVID and its outcome could create a surveillance system humanity has never known. This is what we need to be very awake to.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit deeper down this money pipeline that you're raising and the importance of money. And Bill, you've been really critical in pulling together what's called the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about sort of that campaign for people who don't know about it, and what you see as the important priorities in that work going forward at this point.
Well, in some ways, this is work, Chris, that grew out of this massive divestment campaign that Naomi Klein and I sort of started 9 or 10 years ago. And it's grown into, because there's so many people in so many places who've joined in, has grown into the biggest anti-corporate campaign of its kind in history. We're at about $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have begun divesting from fossil fuel, and it's having a big impact. Shell last year said in their annual report that it had become a material risk to its business, which is good since Shell's business is a material risk to all of us. But in the last couple of years, we've started expanding this out to the kind of next ring, not just the oil companies, but the banks, the asset managers, the insurance companies that support them. So, for instance, I began 2020, though it seems a very long time ago, getting arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest the nation's capital to highlight the fact and kind of launch this campaign that Chase was the world's biggest lender to the fossil fuel industry. They've lent about $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Climate Accords. forget Donald Trump, these guys were sabotaging it all by themselves. So, we've been doing our best to kind of take these guys on. And indeed, after a lot of pressure, Chase a few weeks ago announced that henceforth its business would be what it described as Paris compliant, a phrase that doesn't necessarily mean very much and will doubtless take some more people going to jail to fully flesh out. But it's a good reminder that we can leverage these guys and push them around some. It's been very good to take on the oil companies and take them on really hard, but it's also difficult because, they're going to fight to the last bridge. Exxon only knows how to do one thing. Chase can lend money to all kinds of people, and the fossil fuel industry is an ever smaller part of our economic life. So we're hopeful that we can see some real progress there, and hopeful that action in Washington can kind of help leverage some of that. One reason to think about the financial sector is, Washington, for better or for worse, mostly for better, doesn't really rule the world anymore. But Wall Street, unfortunately, still has enormous global power, and financial markets and institutions, unlike governmental ones, tend to act fairly quickly. Once the tide turns, the tide really turns, and suddenly within hours things are different on stock markets around the world and things. So it may be a tool that we can use to lever real change in the time ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things that you pointed to in some of your work about that is how encouraging it is that the price of solar energy in particular, but other renewables, has dropped to a point where it's actually more economical than fossil fuels. And bringing in, I'm starting to look at some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, and a question from Alec is, about people are concerned about their jobs and personal economics, and a real effort needs to be made to show people that economically they'd be better off with alternative energy instead of the climate change fossil fuel industry. How do we do that? How do we help counter the fake news and help people understand the economics of renewable energies?
Well, I mean, it does get easier the more experience people have with it. And at this point, the polling shows there's enormous support for renewable energy, even in the States. And oddly, the support for things like government support for solar panels crosses party lines in profound ways. I think that probably conservatives and liberals think about things like solar power a little differently. Conservatives tend to think of once you've got solar panels on your roof, your house is your castle, and you don't have to interact with anyone. And liberals probably like being networked with the groovy power of the sun, and whatever it is. But that's all right. I mean, we can work with some of that. The hard case is the people who, through no fault of their own, are working in coal fields or oil and gas fields and need to transition out of that, because those businesses have to go away if we're going to have a working planet. The good news there is that already employment for renewable energy is higher than it is in the fossil fuel industry and will grow enormously. Renewable energy tends to be labor intensive, where fossil fuel industry tends to be capital intensive. And many of the jobs are easily transferable. I just did a piece for the New Yorker about workers in the oil patch in North Dakota, which is hard hit right now and people are out of work, retraining to be wind turbine technicians. And the skill sets overlap easily, and the job is not as bad on your body, and people describe it as a kind of retirement, a job you can retire from. So I think that over time, this is all, completely plausible. And indeed, all the legislation of things like the Green New Deal is full of efforts at funding these kind of transitions. The Republican Party here has always held it up because they're happier having coal miners as kind of hostages to their political strategy,
Yeah. Well, and Vandana, I want to bring in another question here that comes to some of your work recently, and thinking about this relationship between money and technology in different ways. And the question is from Raquel or Rachel. I'm scared to death about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which promises to impose a techno-utopian fourth industrial revolution, which includes all sorts of things around financialization of nature and neocolonialism and geoengineering. And I know you've just recently released a co-authored book or co-edited book about what you call philanthrocapitalism, which is looking at the money in the hands of the billionaires like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and others. And the impact they're having. The book's called Gates to a Global Empire. And I wonder if you can talk a bit more about sort of that work and how that came together and what you see as this sort of role of the philanthrocapitalism money around technological development and how we should be approaching that.
So, the report we've just done is really a very wide coalition that's written about the Gates to a Golden Empire. And I think I've typed in the chat the links. I hope it's come through.
I'll get it for you, Vandana. We'll make sure it happens. I think it might have just sent it to a few people.
Well, I don't do this too smartly. I think it's partly my non-violent, non-cooperation. Coming back to the Gates to a Global Empire is really written because if we think of 2020, in fact, when I was visiting Santa Cruz, that's when the ag tech language was just starting to go all over the place. I remember even in the seminars and with the faculty and the researchers, these issues used to keep coming up. And around that time, the Gates Ag 1 came up. And I wrote a report then, which is part of this larger report. I put the links to that too. But 2015, I had started to look at Gates because Gates was on the stage at the summit in Paris, basically deciding what people should do and government should do. And before that, having attended the UN summits, including the preparatory summits, the Earth Summit, where we did get a legally binding agreement, the UN Framework on Climate Change, and the legally binding Convention on Biodiversity. And this was dismantled in Copenhagen. So basically, Paris was just a voluntary agreement between the polluters, but Gates was strutting around. And I said, something has shifted. Something has shifted so seriously that I must look. And my son, who's very, very bright in tracking data, he wrote the book with me, Oneness versus 1%, which is out from Chelsea Green. And I put the link to that too. But this year alone, there were so many new spheres into which Gates went. I've been working on seed since 1987. And I've been critical of the fact that all the farmers' seeds went to the consultative group on international agriculture research. And then the corporations got it from there for free. And the farmers couldn't get it back. This year, Gates has taken control of the 25 centers where all the world's seeds are held. He controls it in the CG system and in Svalbard. Agriculture, Gates Ag 1. And because we are looking at it, you should see how he's picking up every institution. There's a very clever way of functioning. Here, $1 billion institution, and he'll give a dangling 1 million carrot. And this is his philanthropy. But then he'll suck up the whole. But it's not just the existing systems, the public institutions. He's carving new colonies. That's why I call him the new Columbus. He's carving out new colonies by basically take the example of gene editing. It didn't exist till he started to finance it, and he was very successful in getting the 2 scientists he funded the Nobel Prize this year. Doudna got it. And it's a young technology, which basically mimics or tries to mimic living systems and how they heal themselves and absorb an infection to be able to have resilience. He immediately created, with investors, other investors, including his chief investment advisor, science advisor, who created a company called BNGO. When I was writing my book, I said, what does BNGO mean? Bio-nano-genome. All 3 technologies converging. Created a company called Editas, where all the patents of gene editing are being had. And gene editing is the new GMOs. It's called precise, but there's so much research now on its imprecision. They wanted to make a bull without horns, and it became a bacterial bull because gene editing introduced new bacterial strains. One gene change leads to 1,500 unpredictable genetic changes in an organism. But he's not just the new Columbus carving out new colonies. He's the new Monsanto. We did a Monsanto tribunal in 2017, I think. And then Monsanto disappeared into Bayer. And Germany, which was the strictest country on agroecology, on chemicals, on GMOs, is today undermining European laws. Just like England was used before Brexit, now Germany. Bayer has, even Merkel, this amazing leader, she's a little puppet in Bayer's hands. We threw out golden rice, which pretends to increase vitamin A, but we have hundreds of plants which have hundreds of % more vitamin A, if only we didn't kill them with Roundup. We threw out the BT aubergine. Bill Gates takes failed and rejected technologies that would never have existed in the world. He takes the BT eggplant to Bangladesh, and he takes the golden rice to Philippines, where the people are protesting against the golden rice. And where is it being, the trials being carried out? In the International Rice Research Institute, which he now controls. But he also funds the trials. I think the gates to a global empire would be an interesting report for everyone, including Bill. Bill, you must see what Gates is up to on false climate solutions. You don't protect Gaia. I'm going to engineer her. She's not good enough. I'm going to geoengineer Gaia. Geoengineering is something big in funding. Or gene drives, if you're worried about extinction, to actually use gene editing for gene drives to put species to extinction, in my view, is an absolutely impermissible technology. And then he literally uses a PR firm exactly like Monsanto used to do to try and get votes to support the gene drives when it would have had a moratorium in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So everything Columbus did, he's doing 500 years. Everything Monsanto tried over the last 250 years, Gates is trying to do, and he's trying to do much more. Take education, take any field, take communication. Just today, you must look at this, Bill. His breakthrough ventures, energy ventures, it's fascinating because I've done a piece for the Gates report where he has lab-made breast milk as a climate change solution. Now, that is a bit of a stretch of pseudoscience. Substitute breast milk with lab-made breast milk and say it's a climate solution. But his breakthrough energy ventures has now joined hands with Ambani, who controls all the oil and gas of India. These are very, very important trends to follow. It's really a whole new, I said during globalization, the nation state is disappearing. The corporations are starting to rule the world. And this is why we created the International Forum on Globalization. And now,
Well, I think what's really important in what you're raising, Vandana, I want to turn it to you to be able to respond, but you know, there's this whole other category of multi-billion-dollar philanthropic entities that are also unaccountable and non-transparent.
and empire
How do we hold
creators,
them?
Chris, they create
Exactly.
empires for themselves. They're not just doing
Well, and Bill, there
philanthropy.
was a question for you specifically that relates to this, Bill, from Heidi, who says, I'm curious what you all think about Jeff Bezos's commitment, another multi-billionaire, of $10 billion is the figure Heidi thinks, for climate change work. And so I wonder if you, Bill, can just talk a little bit about the issues that Vandana is raising about Bill Gates, but about philanthropic efforts more generally.
Well, truthfully, I don't think we're going to solve the climate crisis with the help of, 4 or 5 billionaires. Truthfully, I think the best way to think about billionaires at this point is time to tax them so that we have the money to do the things that we need to do. And I take a somewhat jaundiced view of Bezos et al. Anyway. It seems to me that the one thing that unites the richest people on the planet, Bezos and Elon Musk and so on, is that they're busily building rocket ships to leave, which might not be the worst thing for the rest of us, but it's a pretty good sign of, how they view the planet they were born on. Look, this problem is way too big to be solved by a billionaire handing over a couple of $1 billion to some environmental groups to go do something. It gets solved or doesn't get solved by big movements that create big democratic change. And I mean, the most difficult question is whether we have working democracies left to enact that change in. And if we don't, it's above all thanks to the billionaires at places like Facebook that we don't, that have damaged so deeply the societies in which we live that it's getting a little hard to figure out how we're going to make change in the ways that we need.
Yeah. So thinking of social movements trying to make these change, and one thing I wanted to bring in here, Bill, in your 2019 book, Falter, you talk about threats to humanity and of course the ecological threats and the world destroying climate change, but you also talk about technological threats to humanity. And one of the things that really struck me looking through that book is that you also describe 2 particular technologies of hope, one of which is some of the technologies around renewable energies, particular solar, but the other is what you call the technology of nonviolent social movements. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about the implications of thinking of social movements as a technology and how you came to describe it that way. And a little bit more about what you see as sort of the cutting edge of the social movement work that you're most excited about at the moment.
Well, the 20th century really did give us this remarkable new thing, with roots in the 19th century and people like Thoreau and Tolstoy, but flowering from the margins in the 20th century with Gandhi and a million others in India, with Dr. King and a million others in the States, with the suffragists, with, on and on and on. And so what we have now is a kind of imperfectly understood tool that allows the small but many to stand up to the mighty and the few. It's not a perfect tool, though the political science literature now seems to indicate that it works much better than, say, violent revolution in getting done what it aims to do. And the most cutting edge research seems to indicate that when you can get 4 or 5% of a population deeply engaged in a fight, you usually win, which is, in my experience, correct because apathy cuts both ways, and so I think that it's, that's the technology on which we're going to depend. I mean, if we're going to get the technology of solar panels out in sufficient numbers to make a difference, it'll be in part because we're able to leverage social movements to make the kind of basic change that allows that to happen.
Right. Well, on that target of 4 to 5% of a population seems achievable rather than thinking about,
It's not easy. It must be said, it's not easy.
Right.
But yes, and we're seeing, more and more of it. And I bet that, Vandana has been as happy as I have to watch, say, junior high school and high school students all over the world come together around climate change. Everybody knows Greta Thunberg, and everybody should. She's one of the great spirits in the whole world and one of our fellow Right Livelihood laureates. But the good news is, the even better news is, there's like 10,000 Greta Thunbergs all over the world, and they have 10 million followers, who are doing an amazing job.
Yeah. Well, Vandana, I want to come back to you again, thinking about sort of these movements, but also weaving in. There's a number of questions here that sort of both talk about the problems of misinformation and social media, and then also, the importance of certain types of scientific research, but also the inequities of what gets invested in. And lifting up another of your recent publications, it seems like every month you have a new one, a book called The Two Futures of Food, Health and Humanity, seems to be an engagement much more with epistemology, sort of building on the work that you've been doing for decades around these two different pathways of the geoengineering and GMO type future versus biodiversity and agroecology. But there seems to be more of an engagement around sort of knowledge and epistemologies and different ways of understanding the world. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of that knowledge and science framing as it relates to building these appropriate social movements.
Yeah, Chris, the book is this. It's published by a partner organization, should be available for distribution soon. And it was really triggered by the fact that around the same time, a series of patterns landed on my desk. And, ever since I call them the poison cartel, said that they would do genetic engineering in order to patent seeds, I've realized that tracking patterns is a very important way to figure out the kind of economies the powerful want to create, creating these ownership systems. So one was 14 patents and the Jeff Bezos and the investors in this thing called the impossible burger, where real food becomes unimprovable technology and fake food becomes permanently improvable technology. And this, of course, epistemologically is a problem, because a tool for the billionaires is not the measure of nature or of food, of our health or our humanity. They're tools that need to be assessed on the measures that nature gives us, which is the ecological aspects, and the measures our humanity gives us, which is the ethical justice aspects. The second was even more fascinating. It was, I don't know how many of you are aware that, when you do a Google search, you think you're looking only at Google as dealing with all the information. I find interestingly, most of my reports that are totally out of print are available from Google. They never take permission. They just go to libraries and photocopy and sell anyone's publication anywhere without a contract, without permission. But Google has this patent, and Google has a new life sciences division, 5 years old. That's how young it is. It's a 5-year-old infant. And basically the head of this division actually has said that we have to defeat Mother Nature. That's the main reason for creating a life sciences division. Now, over my 50 years now of research in ecology, in science and technology, including my work in quantum theory, I've realized that when you assess a science or a technology, you have to understand it as a system, not as a fragment of a tool. You have to understand the full system. Second, you must assess its impacts before deployment. Otherwise, you get the ozone hole, you get the climate change, you get the thalidomide disaster, you get all the disaster, you get the pesticide disaster and silent spraying. So not only do they want to defeat Mother Nature, they're incapable of looking at alternatives. So why do women have iron deficiency? Because the foods that provided iron-rich diets have been sprayed out of existence by the weedicides and the Roundups. But what does Google want to do? Add nanoparticles in our blood. Now, nanoparticles is 10.9. It can cut through any membrane. Every cell, every organ, our bodies, every organism has membranes of protection. These layers of protection have worked for millennia. A nanoparticle will violate every norm of protection. This is known in ecology, and every scientist is saying that we don't have a science or a technology to even make this assessment. And the House of Lords of UK said, not only must this technology not be commercialized, even its research must be stopped till we are able to develop the tools of assessment. And then, of course, was the Microsoft patent application for the world patent 060606. And they've already got it in the US. And here the human being is reduced to a user whose value will be judged. Yeah, a user whose data is fed into the machine. The machine has algorithms about, there's a lot of talk now on social credit. And this has already been established in China. Yeah? The algorithm will decide what our worth is. And, I've seen in my lifetime, it's a long life, but I've seen in my lifetime from many currencies to single currencies to digital currency. Gates was involved again on the digitalization and war against cash. And they are involved in this. I know they want to do it in the US too. And now into cryptocurrencies, which will not be governed by any bank, any reserve bank, any central bank, any government. And they said it in the patent application. Cryptocurrencies will not be regulated. And they're going to decide what we are worth. Now, can you imagine what's happening to our humanity? So this little book is not just me talking about these three patterns. I called it the civilizational dialogue because I got one of the top Ayurvedic specialists. Ayurveda is the science of life. 5,000 years of learning. What is food? What is health? What is humanity? That humanity is not separate from nature. We are interbeings connected to our food and our air. We can't breathe, yeah? But we breathe when our interconnection is healthy. We are linked with our senses. We are linked with energy, multiple kinds of energy. We are linked with Vigyan, it's called. In our language, we call Vigyan not just knowledge, not just science, but the ability to discriminate between truth and falsehood. That means wisdom. And then, of course, joy of living in accordance with the laws of the earth, of the universe, of your conscience. So this is a dialogue between civilizations. And I hope the diverse cultures of the world will start engaging in this dialogue, because we cannot leave the billionaires who became rich through deregulation of 30 years to decide what humanity will look like in the next 30 years. I know there was a question on the Great Reset, and I have a piece written. I was interviewed by a journalist, and I think it's very important. I've been in Davos at Klaus Schwab's invitation, but it is so wrong for a bunch of rich men to decide this is how you will communicate, this is what you'll be as human beings, this will what be your worth, this will be your, they're all working on one global planetary fake food diet, one agriculture, no farmers, digital agriculture, no food. Do you want a world with zero agroecology? You want a world with zero biodiversity? This is really, I call it bioimperialism of the highest order. And it is about life. Therefore, we need, I call it a civilizational dialogue because it's about deep values. It's not about technology fragments. being imposed on us.
But it's
It
really
is
at that.
about redefining of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be an Earth citizen? What does it mean to be human?
Yeah, at that fundamental level. Thank you for that. Bill, I want to come back to you in the last couple of minutes that we have. And, you know, there's a number of questions here that reflect, I think, a sentiment that many people have that, you know, these problems and issues and campaigns are global in scale. And, you know, Stop the Money Pipeline and the geoengineering. And it's sometimes hard to know what can we do at a local level or in people's own lives. And, you know, there's some questions about, you know, are there priority things we can do in our own lives, our own communities? Is it investing in solar or not? There's also a question here from Pete about public banking, and it sort of raises this question of course, there's one campaign about trying to hold the banks accountable and get them to stop investing in fossil fuel. But then what is the role for alternatives at that local level or public banking or more accountable institutions? And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about how do you think about that relationship between sort of the global campaigns, but how do we link it to people's own lives and choices they make on a day-to-day basis?
Well, first of all, public banking is a really interesting idea. And Rashida Tlaib and some others have just introduced legislation to make it easier to do public banking, and I think it's really important, and people should be thinking hard about it. But on the larger question, I've got to say, if the question that we're dealing with is climate change, look, I'm really glad that my house is covered with solar panels. I'm speaking to you from a EV because I have to drive away to get internet enough to talk to you all. But I'm really glad that I have an electric vehicle, that we have electric buses, that we're. The truth is that having wasted the last 30 years, thanks mostly to the disinformation campaign of the oil industry, there really is not a way, I think, to make the math work. One vegan meal at a time, one Prius at a time, one whatever at a time. We've got 10 years and we've got an extraordinary amount of work to do. So for me, always, the most important thing an individual can do is be somewhat less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to get change done at the scale we need. Now, I think the best kind of organizing, the reason we set up 350.org the way we did, the way that Sunrise Movement is set up the way it is for young people, you know, on and on and on. The best kind of organizing combines ability to work at a local level on city and state legislature and on your community projects and things like that, which are all really key and important, and also allows people to be united 2 or 3 times a year when we need huge national and global pushes around things. So that's why, you know, things like 350.org take the organizational shape that they do, and it allows you to work at a lot of different levels. But yeah, I mean, look, it's important to screw in the right light bulb at home, but it's probably more important to screw in the right senator or to screw in the right set of policies, you know. And that can only happen when we work together in large numbers. That's what politics is about.
Well, I have put in the chat a couple links to your Stop the Money Pipeline, and you mentioned the Sunrise Movement, and so people can get involved in that work that way. And Vandana, we've put links in for some of your books and reports and some of the campaigns you're working on. So I hope people will follow up with that. So we have 2 minutes left, and I want to give you each a chance to, you know, say a last word to the audience of, you know, we still have almost 400 people with us here. And what would you say from, you know, last moment to take away from this moment about social transformation, about points of hope, opportunity, excitement? Like, what keeps you excited and hopeful in this moment and keeps you going that you want to leave with people? And Vandana, I'll start with you and then finish with you, Bill.
What gives me hope is also the reason I resist. What gives me hope is that we are part of an amazing earth. and with tiny bits of the spirit of service, if we do the right thing, there are amazing results. We've done that in Navdanya. We can grow more food by conserving biodiversity. Our farmers earn 10 times more. They don't have to leave the rural areas. We can actually, within a decade, reverse climate change. And there was a question in the chat about regenerative agriculture. And actually, we are talking about not just reducing the emissions, we are talking about healing the broken carbon and nitrogen cycles. These are the cycles of life. And ecological agriculture is the place where it happens. It's totally doable. As long, that's where reclaiming our humanity, our biology, our being part of the earth is both the source of solving the multiple problems, but also not allowing ourselves to get into a new slavery and a new colonization.
Thank you. And Bill?
Well, I'm always made very happy just by knowing that Vandana is keeping going and keeping on. And she has been a hero for so long, and everybody's work, you know, just she's remarkable. And I'm just made hopeful by these coalescing of movements. I don't know if they've come in time. Climate change is the first huge issue the world ever has faced that's come with an absolute time limit, and we're up against it, and it's going to be a lot of damage and hardship done, but it's possible that in the next decade we'll make some real remarkable changes. People listening to this will be around, live long enough, almost all of them, to know whether we manage to do it or not, because we can't really win the climate fight in the next 10 years, but we could lose it. And that's why it's really important to keep people as urgent, engaged, willing to go as we possibly can. So just huge thanks to all those who help all the time, beginning with y'all at Santa Cruz, and especially with Vandana, who's just a hero if there ever was one.
Well, Bill and Vandana, thank you so much for spending this hour with us, and thank you even more for all the work that you do in the world. It's just an inspiration to be in connection with you and to learn from you. And for all of you who have joined us today, thank you again so much. Just a reminder that the Right Livelihood Award for this year has a series of events coming up in December, and I've linked to put in the chat there, and we have a number of events on campus here as well. So I hope you'll join us. And I see Bill has already dropped off, but Vandana, thank you so much, and thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.